Wird heute, wie Sie merken, ein Vortrag ohne Fotos sein. Kjetil wird viel zeichnen und reden. Er wird aber in Englisch reden, weil er mittlerweile sich in der englischen Sprache, was das Fachvokabular betrifft, etwas besser ausdrücken kann. Ich danke mal, das ist heute eine Sto-Lecture, den Firma Sto. Dann danke ich einmal den Leuten, den Firmen, die das ermöglicht haben, dass diese soziale Landschaft und die Ausstellung von Snøhetta realisiert werden konnte. Das war Swarovski, dann Holzbau Höck, Zumtobel in Vista und Carpet Concept, also auf den Teppichen sitzen sie, und wir haben heute eine Busbesuch aus Wien von Architektur in Progress, die heute bei Adlerlacke, die Claudia Berghof ist auch da gewesen sind und morgen dann nach Wattens zum Projekt von Snøhetta und Stögel Süß Obermoser fahren werden. Herzlich willkommen in Innsbruck. Als Wiener darf man das so sagen. Na, kann man immer sagen, ist eh wurscht. Gut, dann danke fürs Kommen. Danke, Kjetil, für dein Kommen. Es gibt noch 2 Abende hier. Nächste Woche wird der Patrick Lütt über das Projekt Wattens reden, und am Ende der Ausstellung gibt es dann ein Konzert von Times New Roman. Also in 2 Wochen ist Times New Roman und heute in einer Woche Patrick Lütt über das Projekt Wattens. Also nicht über Swarovski, sondern über das städtebauliche und Leitbildprojekt in Wattens. Gut, dann wünsche ich Ihnen einen schönen Abend und dir nur nicht zu nervös sein.
Ah ja, das geht schon. Wird schon irgendwie gehen, aber es gibt viele. Danke. Es tut mir leid. Ich habe hin und her überlegt, soll das auf Deutsch gehen, soll es auf Englisch gehen? Ich weiß, aber jetzt bin ich dann drauf gekommen. Ist ja fast wie eine zweite Heimat Österreich für mich, oder? Ich habe in Graz studiert. 8 Jahre lang, 9 Jahre lang, fast dann 10 Jahre lang. Es braucht Zeit, oder? Architekt zu werden. Aber hauptsächlich in Graz studiert, weil mich keine Universität sonst wer angenommen hat. Also das war ganz schön, nach Graz zu kommen, weil die Matura war nicht sonderlich gut, kann man sagen. Aber dann natürlich nach Innsbruck. Und diese Zeit in Innsbruck war eine absolut außergewöhnliche Zeit, kann man sagen. Ich habe so viel gelernt wie noch nie im Leben. Und von dem her, wie Sie ja vielleicht wissen, haben wir jetzt auch ein Büro in Innsbruck, wo wir versuchen, sozusagen den alpenländischen Raum, aber auch deutschsprachigen Raum zu beeinflussen. But, unfortunately, I have to switch to English. Otherwise, I'm losing myself in this German language, and I would sort of start moving in circles if I had to. So, unfortunately, it has to be in English. What I'm trying to do today is an experiment. I've never done this before. It's the first time. No pictures for the first time. I usually, you know how architects are. We love to have these pictures in the background and go back and point at them and say, we did this, look at this plan, isn't that beautiful? Look at this facade, isn't it absolutely marvelous? And who could do it better? Sort of thing. So what I'm going to try to do, and we can talk afterwards. I'll include Patrick in some of these conversations also. Where are you? Where did you go? Oh, still there. You sat down, right? Okay. Well, and then also maybe, if possible, we could have a conversation afterwards. I would love to sort of maybe get a little bit of feedback. As you know, this exhibition here meant a lot to us. We were able, thanks to Out, sort of to challenge the spaces, focus on the things we wanted to show, and relations is part of that theme, is part of a way of thinking. And as you know, thinking in architecture is not something that is necessarily promoted by schools or others. So again, back to this sort of social landscape and the way we're sitting here. It's a little different. And from that point of view, what I'm going to try to do is to involve you a little bit in some thinking through diagrams, very simple diagrams. What might be in a diagram? What is the core of trying to explain something without designing? Before the design actually happens, how do we think? How do we involve the people? What kind of things do we have to draw in order for us to be able to portray pictures into different people's minds? How do we actually interact with other professions, and how do they influence us when they leave themselves as professionals around the table? And the architect becomes the artist becomes the sociologist becomes the philosopher becomes the landscape architect. What happens when you turn everything around and you start looking at only things that might mean something for a possible design? So this is what I'm going to try to do. And by doing that, I will have to try to sketch. I've even sketched out what I'm supposed to sketch. And I wouldn't normally do that, but I had to, because this is really a way of trying to teach myself something new. So you're all part of a first-time event for me, and I'm happy to do it here. At the same time, I am nervous, because I know a lot of people here. It's my home turf. You know, they know when I'm lying, you know. And this is difficult. You will be judged by the people you know much harder than by the people who just take what you say for granted. And for the time being, I'm waiting until this is over, and then we'll see how people have perceived it. I'll talk you through some, and not, of course, everything we keep dealing with and how we deal with it, but some few principles, maybe, which sort of relate to things that we developed throughout the years. We've been doing some post-rationalization on some sort of emotional way of thinking the last few years. We're sort of not streamlining ourselves, but sort of trying to define certain things that we intuitively have done over a long period of time, and now trying to sort of fix it, pinpoint it, bring it down, back in, understand why did we actually do the things we did. And we've had some PhD programs running, sort of studying us when we're working, seeing what the drivers are, where do we tick off things, and how does it actually move forward. So I'm not bringing the principles out of this book, but these are sort of tick-off points that we've been debating and discussing for many, many years. So, you know, just take it as it is, and then we can discuss further. The first principle, although there is a certain amount of generism in our architecture, which is, you could count for many places, we have landed in a way defining ourselves as conceptual contextualists. Now, what might that mean? It means that you react specifically to a place when you design architecture. So you could say we've distanced ourselves from style. But distancing yourself from style could be a style in itself. So you have to move around in order for you to understand how you move forward. Now, in this particular sense then, conceptual contextualism comes out of a long history of general rules, laws, that sort of have a huge impact on architecture. So what happens when you release yourself from these kind of things? One of the slogans that we have been using a lot is form follows environment. So form is generated out of that particular situation which you're in at that particular point in time. But it could also be referred back to Christian Norberg-Schultz, a theoretician in Norway, who said, thing follows place. Now, thing is more than an object. Thing is a gathering of people. Storting in Norwegian. The thing, as such, is a place where you make decisions. So the object is, in itself, already something that has made a decision on behalf of others, because it is generated. It's actually created. So from this point of view, the two first drawings I would like to make is about reference systems. It's about trains. It's about one train moving at 40 kilometers an hour, and another train, as you learned in school, moving at 20 kilometers an hour. What is your relative speed? Your relative speed is 20 kilometers an hour. compared to the other train. Now that's a reference system. So how does that work when you relate it to landscapes, for instance, and architecture and constructed work? What kind of reference systems do you actually pin onto the wall and say, maybe this is the contrast that you're looking for in order to measure speed? So let's just say, for the sake of this first exercise, you have a landscape like this, flat. Now, what kind of structure is contrasting this landscape? And you've seen this many times before. This is contrasting this landscape, meaning based on this line you can read this, and based on this line you can read that. What happens in the opposite direction? You have a landscape here, looking like this. What is then constructed is this. And the space between these two conditions doesn't really matter at one point whether they are constructed or not, because they are at the time when they are actually built new realities, which means we relate to them in the same way we relate to a landscape. Principle 1. Principle 2 is a little more difficult, although in many ways also simpler. Principle 2 is what we call displacement theory. Mass is constant. Mass, Earth mass is constant. So what actually happens, let's say you have the ground here, you dig out here, and you fill up here. If this is solid, if this is x, y, and y, this equals this. Displacement. Architecture works principally with displacement. Even if you hollow this out and turn it into a building, you will have a displacement of materials which actually create your other world, which creates the thing. So based on that simple fact, if you took the calculation of constructed volume mass, we would have a hole in the Earth that brings us almost to the middle, with a diameter of 3 kilometers. Mass is constant. Principle number 2. Yeah. I love this. So principle number 3 is about us. It's about our conception and how we conceive our surroundings. Moving back to the human body, just for a second. We're moving into a visual world where almost 80% of our input is visual. 20% maybe through the air. And more so in direction of music only. So the social media that we're operating operates with writing and less with sound in communication. So we're increasing the visual element of communication, and we're decreasing the use of the air. Now, is that really wise? So, principle number 3 is, in fact, I don't know whose air it is, but it doesn't matter, it's not Van Gogh's. What is this? What has and what portrays the air in the perception of our surroundings? 360 degrees. What does that mean? When you're here, you're in the center. The air is always in the center of happenings. So what does that mean in relationship to the eye? Cleopatra's eye. 124 degrees. only. So the eye is in the periphery, looking in, and the ear is in the center, listening out. And only through the combination of these two can you locate yourself in the world. If you diminish the actual listening capacities of our own brain from inside and outside, we're losing location. We're losing place. Now, it's worthwhile thinking of, because this is one of the things we're debating a lot, and it's principle number 3. Principle number 4 has to do with the visualization of putting things again in context. Now, let's assume that the principle is debating the framing of a section, the frame within the eye. If you have a horizon up here, means that where the horizon is, also your eye is. You always carry an individual horizon with you. My horizon is right here. When you're sitting there, it's there. When you're sitting up there, it's there. It follows you continuously through your life, as long as you can see. The horizon follows you continuously through your life. When you frame it, you give it a vertical reference. So the next layer could, for instance, be a forest, a field, and a very close-up of much more detailed perspective of what you see. So, what happens when you have a frame? Your eye focuses differently. It doesn't zoom in and out in the same way as it does if I'm looking at you or looking at someone at the back. The frame, which is architecture, creates the reference for you to understand how you should use your eyes. If you turn your head upside down, look through your legs, do it once in a month, the blood comes pouring towards your brain, and you will automatically understand why you need framing, because your whole color perspective changes with more blood in the brain. So then you understand why we need these fixed points. Why do we still create spaces? Why haven't we, and we could have technically generated spaces, have no walls, no ceilings, no floors? Why do we still believe in space? Because it references us and our way of focusing and living. Principle 5 is about the dynamics of the body. It's about how you walk. And this is a diagram that actually follows Laurie Anderson from a very famous record. And she said, walking is preventing yourself from falling forward. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that in a stable situation like this, say, all forces are vertical. We know how to stand on 2 feet, bringing the forces straight towards the center of the earth. What happens when you start walking? When you start walking, this sort of happens, right? See if I can draw this again. Let's say something like this. Right? Then you have a vector moving you in this direction. So these two together create a vector diagram. Which again describes the multiplication of these two vectors, which actually gives you your understanding of walking. Now again, it's a diagram, but it tells you something about vectorization in relationship to your own body. So why can we actually abstract things? Because we can do these things. We have the math, we have the science. We understand how it works. That's why we can interpret it back into physical shape. Principle number 5. Talking about capitalism and socialism. Principle number 6. The ground. Very simple diagram. This is our culture. And this is our commerce. Why? Because the footprint that we generate in the perception of our cities has to have a clear relationship to the horizontal and the vertical. The more commercial, the smaller the footprint should be. The more cultural, the wider the footprint should be. It's our common ground. And if it's cultural, if it's open, accessible, the urban footprint should relate exactly to how it includes the public. Now, I've introduced some very few principles. Maybe you're interested in seeing how these have evolved through some of the projects. Maybe there is a possibility to actually use this same way of thinking into trying to generate certain elements of design which are not yet designs. Let me start with the library in Alexandria. The library in Alexandria is based on a horizontal line, and one line cutting through that horizontal line. In plan, it's a circle, as you know. What this really is moving part of the ground into a certain position. Now, by doing this shift around this point, you could easily say that it simulates certain types of movements. You could easily say that it kind of follows a solar path, which again means that you really relate it to time. So that means whatever you've turned out of the horizon could be both the future in time or the past. And so could the element being pushed into the ground, the negative element, could be the past or the future. What is interesting, though, is this place, and that's the present. That's where you have your 2 feet on the ground. Now, there's a lot more to this diagram than you know before you start talking to engineers and really understanding what this means. Because under the site in Alexandria, you had a water level. You had the Mediterranean floating in, 3 meters below the site. So what does that actually mean for this kind of sectional diagram that led to the library? First of all, let me make one comparison. Or maybe I'll do the other one first. Because, again, the horizon, the building with its volume underground. Now, of course, here you're cutting through the present, but at this point, the building is very light. Here, it's very heavy. So through this breaking point line, you have a structural forces diagram which looks exactly like the section of the building. 0 forces here. Here you have to hold the building up. Here you have to hold the building down. because it's floating up because of the water. So what does this mean? You have a mirror picture of the section under the horizon. So where did that come from? Well, that comes from the pyramid. The pyramid is solid, which means the forces diagram of a pyramid is a mirror of its own solidity in the sand. So the forces, the line forces that you have, in the end ends up with a pyramid. Which means, in the end, you have three pyramids. You have the forces diagram underground, you have the pyramid itself, and then you have the pyramid with its bottom in endless time. And the same happens with the torus, which could curve continuously like the library from the geometry point of view, like a car tire. It could spin endlessly around itself. And because of these forces, however, its landing position is always wanting to get back to the horizontal level. Forces pushing it up, forces pushing it up this direction, pushing it down in this direction. Actually, where it wants to be is here. Alexandria Library. These were the first sketches. These were the first discussions. And as you can see, it led directly to a section of the building. Okay, I probably need more, but that's okay. I can talk about the others then. I have to make smaller sketches. Okay, I'll make smaller sketches from now. But yeah, maybe let me just say, okay, this particular interpretation of a sectional diagram which explains you space has led us to believe that transition is a negotiational method. So how, for instance, did that appear in the Opera House in Oslo? This is the land, and this is the sea, with a very clear edge. The land belongs to Norway. The sea belongs to the world. So not only do you have a breaking point between Norway and the rest of the world, but you have an absolute breaking point, where one is fluid, and the other one is fixed. So land and sea needed to negotiate for this particular location. So based on a lot of the discussions we had here, we created a negotiable surface. That negotiable surface became the roof, which people then could walk on and sit on, just like here. It didn't define a building in the first place. It defined a plane. And that plane is the negotiator between the sea and land. I'll make them a lot smaller. But when you negotiate shapes in diagrammatic form, you could say there is another element missing in that kind of equation that would happen in such a diagram. And that is, again, the top of the roof meeting the sky. So what happens when you have the sky here with the clouds, with the sun, and a person's eye being located right here? That means you don't have a barrier. There is no barrier between the water and the roof, but there is also no barrier between the roof and the sky. So you could claim it is a true negotiator. And based on that, this roof then becomes public ownership, because it puts you in a position to understand yourself better than before you went on the roof. You discover things in yourself that you did not know you had before you walked there. And if there is anything in architecture in the future, and in art for that matter, is all about increasing sensitivity and sensibility in our communities. There is no other way of dealing with it. So if we move from the roof into the landscape situations again, and look at the viewpoint Snøhetta, which is exhibited in a big picture downstairs, you have this kind of soft, high-level mountain landscape in Norway that sort of follows the blue line as it does here, right? So what did we do as a diagrammatic approach to viewpoint Snøhetta? The reference frame, and then filling it up with the adoption of an internal reference that starts moving you back between the inside and the outside. So it's landscape structure, it's landscape reference, and it's structural landscape. And none of these are done before we put them into a cultural context. There is no such thing, again, as something in the sense of defining culture as something that isn't specific, isn't concrete, isn't right there with you. Because everything we do become new realities again once they're built. They're no longer abstractions. Right. So what happened at ground zero? Displacement theory. You know the two footprints of the towers. Right. What were the waterfalls of the two towers? What was the name of this? It was mirroring the past. You leave emptiness. Right? Where the footprints of the towers were located, you leave nothing except the water that falls along the four sides, along here. And the name of the project is Mirroring the Past. Our little project is here. We define that again where we want to be, the present. And these huge high-rise buildings, which kept looking down on all of this by all the Norman Fosters and Marquis and Biggs of this world, looking down at this building and saying, we're the future. So all of a sudden, again, you have a sectional diagram of past, present, and future. Footprint commercial, footprint cultural, and footprint past. My grandfather used to say, when you're out walking, and walking is important, you have certain positions related to your head. You look forward to know where you're going. You look down, not to stumble, and knowing where you're putting your foot. You look up to dream. And sometimes you turn around and look back to see where you came from. And if you do this in the right proportions, you walk. Before you do this in right proportions, you're out stumbling. So, ground zero. Project number 5, King Abdul Aziz Center for World Culture in Dhahran. A lot of political issues related to exactly this project. I will not get into the political issues now, we can debate them afterwards. But I can just tell you it's the first public cinema in Saudi Arabia. One entrance for women and men. We forced them to kiss behind the bookshelves in the library. So there are a lot of political issues, but let me go back to the diagrams. And I think I'll use the space here. So what is the single most vulnerable thing that you're dealing with when you talk about such subtle culture, where you cannot really paint the portrait of a person and say it actually represents art, where abstraction is the only way of producing art? You have to find different ways of explaining, and of course, again, The ground is always there in architecture, always. And then the interpretation of a very badly built Roman arch. You remember the conversation between Kublai Khan and Marco Polo in Invisible Cities, talking about the keystone, it could be this one, as our culture. What happens when you remove this keystone away? Critical thinking tells us collapse. It falls apart. It does no longer exist. There is no arch. One could claim, however, that as long as you manage to keep the pressure between each element, you're not in a critical position. So how does that diagram reflect to society? It means every stone is depending on the other, even in a society in Saudi Arabia. It's also a value chain, which says, without this foundation, you don't have a keystone. So culture is a defining end keystone to the whole structure of how we perceive ourselves and how we deal with ourselves again. So how did that diagram then influence again on the section of the King Abdulaziz Center? Slightly different from before. Here, the ground, but now slightly curved. One element with the foundation point to the ground. Another element with a foundation point to the ground. And a keystone in between, floating. This is critical. If you remove this stone, the whole building collapses. Right? So simply, from one diagram to the other, you've introduced critical thinking in the sense of lifelong learning in Saudi Arabia. And these are methods of explanation. When you're trying to convince someone about what they're doing, don't show them a design, show them your thinking. There is no architecture, and I'm all about this, there is no today. There is no architecture without good critical thinking. The design, the pen, is only our tool. It's in our body, it's in our head, in our stomach, in our feet, in our hands. We create architecture with the full amount of our body. And critical thinking is the most essential part of that venture. So these diagrams together all relate somehow to time. And time becomes at the essence and at the core of all these things as the buildings grow older and as they move into certain situations, possible situations of the future. Another terminology which we've had some issues with throughout the last few years, when we talk about public ownership that actually generates action for the public, like for instance when the library in Alexandria was protected by the inhabitants of Alexandria during the Spring Revolution by them holding hand around the building 24 hours a day. No hooligans got in and the library never closed. So how do you get to a point where you have this sort of public ownership related to certain elements that you build? Well, one of the debates we've had, I'm just going, because we are uncertain about this theme. Because keylessness, kein Schlüssel, Schlüssel weggeschmissen. What could a structure long-term be if you relate to keylessness in architecture? What could 24-hour openness and attitude actually be in architecture in these critical times of security and safety? I think it is the only way you can solve the situation, by generating more public access, transparency. But we are having this debate every day with the projects that we're dealing with. You need a security desk Damn it, right here. Don't let anyone behind this line. Don't open up the doors. Leave them closed. So for a period of time now, we've been defining a series of keyless projects, open 24 hours a day. Some of them are presented in the room below. So what could we possibly achieve by doing that? Change of attitude. Like the viewpoint Snøhetta that I was trying to sketch in the landscape. The notion of making people vandalize, which we wanted to. We wanted them to use their knives and engrave their names into this kind of place. They're not doing it. You have to force them. You have to start. So what happens when you break these kind of conventions of understanding? Why does everyone have to look at the other to protect himself? Why do we have to tell someone about the mistakes others are doing when we're doing exactly the same ourselves? I know it sounds religious, people, but in a sense, I think these values are the values we're fighting for today, especially in the turmoil of this Europe that we're seeing these days. I wanted to have a debate with Patrick, but maybe no. Because keyless is important. Keyless means that you can put a name to what you've done. You throw away the lock. It's simple, straightforward. Do I still have one? Okay. So I'm getting there. I'm almost finished. We can have a conversation later about these things. But this keyless things also demands rethinking diagrammatic of the programming that we're seeing these days. We have a fixed opinion on what is outdoor and indoor functions. Even in this city, with so much nature, I feel quite certain that you're spending more than 80% of your time indoor. The average of the world is over 90% indoor. And 20% of these 90% are on the toilet. So never neglect the toilet anymore. You know, 20% of your life, of the 90% you spend indoor, you actually deal with this flushing invention. And it's dramatic. It is kind of dramatic. So our notion of functions in diagrammatic sense starts becoming a serious business. You don't design based on accepting a program just coming out of the notion of habitual thinking. Habits are the worst things to deal with because we take them for granted. We believe that this is the way it's done. We know that red is hot water and blue is cold water. But why? Certain nominations in society are correct and others are not. We need some rules to be able to follow. But for us to move forward, we also need to break some rules. And especially in the architectural business, we need to break quite some few rules. Because all the legislations that we're surrounded with are coming late. They're coming based on what we knew 5 years ago. Because every legislative institution in any country in the world is a delay on what you know. So how has this influenced some of the thinking of some of the projects we've done? One of them is the plate tower at Swarovski, which quite simply, even the pen, okay, I'll do it like this. The plate tower at Swarovski. You take what is normally known to be here, and you locate it here, inside. Why do you do that? Because the perception of that particular space allows you to change the thinking of a playground. All of a sudden, you can have the kids climbing 20 meters high in a protected environment. I have to say also we tried to introduce some sort of hobby place in the basement where the kids could play with knives, but they wouldn't let us. it is this kind of reprogramming issue of self-programming through play, through activity. So where did we do that exactly same thing? I'll try to make it smaller. At the Ryerson University in Toronto. Taking all the outdoor perceptions of urban life and putting them inside for the students to self-program. The different layers are called different things. It's called the beach, the forest. No teachers telling you exactly what to do. Open 24 hours a day and self-programmed by the students. So reprogramming today does not only mean to take care of public spaces between buildings. It means to include the buildings into our definition of public space. Connect it to the public areas surrounded by it. I'm not sure how many of you know Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is this kind of thing. It's surrounded by water on an island. And it has a lot of heavy buildings sitting on very soft ground. So when they constructed Angkor Wat, what did they do? They saw that the weight of these buildings would push the earth in this direction and this direction. To counterweigh the movement of the earth, they dug canals around it to increase the pressure on these walls. So this pressure equals this pressure. And all of a sudden, you had a stable ground. We use this for something called MaxLab, which is an atomic accelerator for the University of Lund in Sweden. Now, the accelerator is a circular accelerator, as we know from CERN also, where the atomics spin at amazing speed around until you sort of find this black hole. Now, what does this mean? It means that the vibration generated, both from the outside and inside, might actually affect the precise movement of these atomic movements. So what can you do? Like in Angkor Wat, you can generate a landscape where you counter-vibrate the vibration of this ring simply by looking at the section vibration. So the waves of the landscape equal the frequency of vibration coming out of the atomic accelerator. And all of a sudden, you have the counterweight to the actual production line of this particular thing. Now, I'm getting close to a possible conversation. You have one more? Two more? Okay, let me just put one. You have two more. I could have made much bigger pictures. Let me put one statement out there for you. It's not a diagram, it's a statement. What does this mean? It means the construction industry, we produce 40% of the CO2 produced every day in the world through our profession. I'm letting this sit in this room, but take it. Be absolutely aware that the climate change is coming, and it's everyone's responsibility within their own practice, within their own projects, to get as close to a CO2 neutral building as absolutely possible. So in fact, I'm getting very close to my ending. We gave a task we have these Dovre conversations. Dovre is the area where Snøhetta is the highest mountain. And we meet up there every year for what we call the Dovre conversations. This year, our Dovre conversations were in Innsbruck. 2 weeks ago, we had 130 people in the same room as here. We were partying for 3 days, learning. So I'm sure you will hear more Norwegian than Axel Lund Svindal's Norwegian here in Innsbruck in the future. Which actually means there is a strong relationship between these landscapes, the Norwegian landscape and the Alps. The Alps are more extreme than the Norwegian mountains, but we have the sea. And in general, and let this also be floating in the air, in general, the mountains and the sea are more interesting things. As they say in Norway, these two guys sitting on a boat, which actually was taken by the storm, turned over. It rains and snows, this really wet snow, and it's full storm. And one yells to the other, sitting over the keel of the boat, yelling to the other, saying, "Poor those who are up in the mountains today." So, what we did at Snøhetta Conversations some time ago, we challenged everyone to try to draw this one-line Snøhetta logo. So what I'm doing, I'm ending with this, and I have, of course, the kind of answer here. Only 10 people managed, and I'm really happy about that. So thank you. I didn't.